Hey gang! Since we're about to enter another CIG information drought while they go on their winter vacation and then bounce into their planning sessions early next year, basically for the first half or 3/4 of January, and with salvaging being a hot topic at the moment, I thought this might be a good time to take some guesses, let's call it mild speculation, on what the future of the salvage loop will be. And then we could look back on this video in a year or three and see how close I was to the mark. So, sound fun? Let's get this. So I'm going to break down the salvage loop into what I think will probably be 9, actually let's call it 10 distinct steps. So for the first one, I think the loop will probably begin outside of the actual salvager itself. So let me explain. While I think the salvage missions will be mainstays, I also think that those missions will eventually be able to be generated by the players as well. So I'm going to start this loop here with a terrapin. Info runners are what I think will be the end game of the exploration game loop, which would actually make a pretty good speculation video of its own now that I think about it. Why did I say that out loud? Damn it. Anyways, explorers will go out and find the thing. In this case, the thing will be the wreck in need of salvaging. At this point, a mission is generated, or they somehow communicate the information of that wreck and the location of the wreck to the salvager, either through a salvage claim that they can sell or just via old school talking to an org mate or in chat or whatever. The info is run, in other words. So for step 2, this is where the salvager comes in. The salvager will look at the data in the claim, or just take a look at the wreck itself if they were the ones that found it, or a friend or org mate found it and they can see it in person. With eyes on the prize, they'll decide if it's actually worth salvaging at all. Some salvagers might be more desperate or inexperienced than others. A wreck that a reclaimer would turn its nose up at might be the perfect gem for someone who's solo salvaging in a vulture. In fact, that kind of striation in the loop will probably be critical to its success. Each ship in the line, from the vulture to whatever ships are in between the vulture and the reclaimer, has to have its niche, or there's no reason to run that specific ship. And that's a truism that's going to carry through all the loops, not just salvaging. But also salvaging. Just saying. So for step 3, once the salvager decides to salvage the wreck, the first step will probably be to make the wreck as safe for salvaging as possible. And really most of the rest of the steps here sort of encompass this, but I'm kind of including this first step as its own thing. This will likely be where most of the action takes place. In real life demolition, actually taking down the building, so exploding it, the actual structure itself, is usually the easy part. The hard part is taking out all the stuff that can make that final step dangerous. Removing windows, cables, machinery. I think salvaging will probably be similar. A lot of this will rely on the engineering loop and resource management, which is still at least a few months off. Of course, a salvager might just go for fast and dirty, but they'll do so at their own risk. In some cases, that risk might even be worth it. As I said, most of the following steps are related to this making the wreck safe to break apart, so join me on this little journey. Provided the wreck isn't a total wreck and isn't just open to space, the first step in this making the wreck safe thing will probably be to vent the atmosphere. A salvager that just pulls up to a wreck and starts eating it might be in for a bad time. It's hard to say if it would work like hard space shipbreaker and explosively decompress, but it's certainly a possibility. If a salvager starts eating a fully pressurized ship, or even one with pressurized rooms, think to the room and atmosphere system that's coming with the engineering game loop, they could definitely be looking at explosions at least as dangerous as those of, let's say, a mineable rock. Added to that, there's a reason this thing is a wreck, and I'll come back to this a couple times. The inside could easily be on fire. Venting the atmo could extinguish that the easy way. Once the atmosphere is vented off or collected, a salvager could actually go inside the wreck to see what's up. For a ship like the Reclaimer, this part would probably be done by the drones, and that's another piece of tech that this ship and a few others are still waiting on. Once inside the wreck, salvaging will likely build off that resource management loop. This will probably include pulling sources of power and combustion, things that could explode in other words, and hopefully have some value if they aren't damaged. I mean, again, there's a reason why this thing is a wreck. Some of those components are going to be junked. On the point of things that could explode, though, think about the gravity generator in particular, but also all of the various components, and probably even the planned relays scattered throughout bigger ships. Think a jump drive would explode if it was eaten? I do, maybe pretty impressively. So for the next step, along with the components, the salvager will probably need to siphon off any fuel, both hydrogen and quantum. Again, the goal is to remove anything that would make eating the wreck more hazardous to the salvager. Bonus that the fuel will likely be able to be recycled and resold. Now that I think about it, probably the atmosphere, the oxygen would be too. Or just they could use it to keep the salvager itself going. For step 7, cargo can be dragged out if it's valuable too. And as salvagers are discovering right now, maybe the value of this cargo would be more valuable than the wreck itself. Going into info running, maybe there's information on board in the form of notes on tablets or the locations of treasures or whatever. The kind of mission giver in a box that CIG seems to be leaning towards, or that you see in commonalities in other games. And info running itself is a whole other loop we'll probably maybe see one day. Eventually. So the salvager can cash in on that info itself by either selling it or just using it themselves. For step 8, now that the wreck is truly an empty husk, now the salvager starts eating it. This is where we get into what's in the game right now and how I think it'll significantly change moving into the future. The first step is the peeling off the skin of the ship. At the moment, recycled material composite, RMC, is one of the most valuable commodities in the game. I'd say enjoy it while you can because I don't think that'll last. At the moment, it's way overvalued just to get people to test the salvaging loop. And in that sense, it's working pretty well. Eventually, RMC should be a pretty simple base resource, although I do think the value will vary based on what ship you're salvaging. Drake, it'll probably be pretty cheap stuff given Drake's lore reputation for cheaper holes and cutting corners. Origin, RMC might be worth a little bit more. Military vessels, thick and heavy armor, will probably be more valuable or yield more RMC. Since CIG has not said anything about refining being a part of the salvaging game loop, I think it'll probably lean more into producing a higher volume than producing a higher quality of good. You get the idea. We have a very rudimentary implementation of this mechanic at the moment, and it's probably awaiting ship armor to come in before it makes the leap to the next tier. Knowledge, or desperation, or lack of wrecks in the area will likely drive the salvager and should make them more or less picky. In a system with a lot of high-value wrecks, like let's say a war zone, you see salvagers turning up their noses at anything but the best stuff. In systems that are more sparse, they'll likely be glomming onto that picked-over Drake cutter just because it's likely the best thing they'll find. Like mining, if you've been searching for rocks for hours and hours and hours and not finding anything, you might make a go for that iron or Hephaestion rock just because it's better than bringing back something than nothing. In that sense, salvaging will probably be the same. Also, the value of RMC will probably be driven by the demand for it. So this is yet another thing waiting for Tony Z's Quantum, which in turn is waiting on the servers to be stable and robust enough to support it. And if you're asking me to really speculate, I think Tony Z's team has been pulled onto Squadron 42. So with the release of that game, we might see more focus on Quantum, and by then, the server should be able to handle it. Moving on to step 9. Once all the skin has been removed, a salvager should be left with the true husk of the former ship. Just the skeletal remains. Again, there will probably be a little variety in the bones of a ship. Origin military ships will probably be near the top, either producing a higher grade material or producing more material. But I would suspect it's probably going to be the former for the reasons I said earlier. Of course, even the trash skeletons could be refined down to better stuff, maybe, if they implement that game loop. You're just probably going to lose some material doing that. That goes for RMC and what's being called structural for now. Eventually, I think we'll be using Maelstrom to cut off chunks of the hull, as opposed to just exploding the whole ship. And there will be some sort of balance in here, such as there can't be any skin on the section of vehicles and the shields have to be off. And apparently now the whole ship has to be powered off before you can break it apart. It's around here that things can go catastrophically wrong if the first, let's say, 7 or 8 steps haven't been checked off. Do I think breaking up a ship will be more complex than it is now? Yeah, but I don't think it'll be much more complex. The salvager, much like in Hard Space Shipbreaker, will probably need to cut the ship along specific lines. Or maybe with Maelstrom, they won't even need to worry about that, and the focus will be around making the chunks the right size so they can be ingested by the grinder or the sucker, whatever you want to call that thing. And maybe that's where the Reclaimer's Claw comes in. I've said this elsewhere, but while I think the claw is an incredible, cool looking design element, a claw in a game that has tractor beams and the salvage ships have thrusters that can move around the wreck, a giant claw pretty much makes zero sense. And I know that that's an unpopular opinion because a lot of people, myself included, saw the concept image with the giant claw and thought that was amazing and sort of the thing that the whole ship was built around. And so, while underwhelming, even in this rudimentary state, a cracking beam, especially in a game with artificial gravity, makes more sense. Yeah, even if it does add one more magical space beam to beam Citizen. I think Maelstrom will eventually add a bit more complexity to this, as I'm hoping it'll allow the ship to be cut along those different lines rather than the predefined chunks that we have now. I'm going to recommend that we call the person that operates this claw the clawperator. Either way, I don't think the current iteration is all the gameplay the claw or the clawperator will have. Moving on. Something I'm hearing over and over is that the salvage loop lacks complexity. While I agree that breaking up a ship has to be more than just holding down a mouse button, the complexity of the salvage loop, if I had to take a guess right now, will be around the pre-gaming, planning, and prepping. That's a lot of P words. But again, one way CIG could go, and probably should go, is a completely different experience than that of mining, and would appeal to a different type of gamer, looking for a completely different gameplay experience. So it'll be more about knowing what you're salvaging, its innate value, and the dangers of that ship, or that wreck, and going through the entire process of making the wreck able to be ingested. Finally, at step 10, the salvager can go off and sell all of this stuff, either to wholesalers like the TDDs on various planets, or just directly to repair ships. On that note, with all my talk about synergy and other vids, I think there will be a ton of synergy between salvage and repair. I think RMC and construction material will be relatively cheap, but there will be some variance with higher quality ships or military grade armor, either producing a greater volume of material, or the material itself will need less refinement, or the material will just be more valuable as is. So think of iron versus laranite, for example. I'm not even sure CIG knows the answers to some of these questions yet, and all of this is just guesswork on how I think the loop might work. Some of this is probably years off, while some of these questions might be answered in the next couple months at the most. I should probably point out here that I couldn't find anywhere where CIG said that refining would be part of the salvage loop, so better quality will probably result in a larger volume. Maybe. Probably. It stands to reason that components, skins, and the bones of the ship combined should not be more valuable than the ship itself. In other words, a cutlass right now in-game costs about $1.4 million. It would stand to reason that, minus any cargo you might find on board, which would definitely be drugs on a cutlass, the value of all the standard salvage stuff that makes up a cutlass would never be worth more than that 1.4 million mark, and probably about half that at a guess. I think a big part of a salvager's job, of their skill set, of their mindset, will be to take a look at a wreck and decide if it's better to just get a few components or repair work from somewhere else and get that wreck running again, as opposed to eating it. In that case, they might be able to sell data about the ship to a repair ship, or if there's not a lot of work to be done, do it themselves. Then they have the value of a working cutlass rather than the lesser value of its components. So that's another aspect of the salvaging loop we might see one day, and probably someday soon. As mentioned in the last vid, salvaging will probably be more knowledge-based than Twitch reflexes-based. Salvaging is not mining. Mining is Twitch. Salvaging will probably be something else. We already have gameplay for the miners and the people who like that style of gameplay. For an example, my friend Wolfie, who owns Yaz Queen here, does it to de-stress after work. He doesn't want gameplay that's stressful in and of itself to compound that, and he's not alone. Should it be a little more complicated than it is in the current iteration? Sure. Does it need to be a nail-biting race and struggle against the wreck, like mining is against the rock? No, not really. There's obviously a group of gamers out there, maybe not in the community at the moment, that like those cleaning games. So you know the ones I'm talking about, the sort of pressure washer, restore this car house, whatever games. That might be what CIG is going for here, just a slower paced gameplay. I do think they'll gamify the current iteration and make it more skill-based than it is right now. But by the same token, once a miner has broken the rock, how do they hoover up the chunks they want? Yeah, that's right. They just point at the rocks that they want and click and hold it down, and that's it. All the skill of mining is involved in finding of that rock, knowing what that rock's value is, and then breaking it without having it explode. Collecting the ore is the easy part. I could see salvage being real similar to mining in the sense that most of the skill is going to be in the prep work. Actually, eating the rock, or the ship in this case, is the easy part. And perhaps, just maybe, the real salvaging will be the friends we make along the way. And that's all I have for this one, gang. Catch me next time.